Hello, everyone. I wanted to quickly go over the week 5 study questions on Glenn Gray's The Idea of Death in Existentialism. Number 1, what point is Gray making about Geborgenheit, which is the German word, I suppose, for safety? Well, there is none, I suppose, and not in any absolute sense. I think that the most striking thing that explains this is this idea on the part of Heidegger that the human condition is one of exposure. And that exposure, ultimately, is an exposure to death. I think that is very close to Hans Jonas's point that one of the senses of mortality is the ever-present possibility of death. We live our lives in constant exposure to death, and there is no real safety in human life. There's relative safety, of course. The word still has meaning, but in the absolute sense, the human being lives always exposed to death, which just means that they're finite, and that finitude could announce itself at any time. As I think in our conversation today about Gray, I think it was well understood from looking at the discussion board that the existentialists feel that we have a natural tendency as human beings to seek safety, to seek security, and I think we do, and I think it's important to feel safe, but in the ultimate sense, it's an illusion, in the sense that we can't really achieve that kind of safety, security, and that we should at least acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that in order to live in truth. Number 2, what is Jasper's idea of the boundary situation? What other human experiences does he include besides death? Well, I take it that the idea of the boundary situation are these limits that we run into in life beyond which we cannot imagine anything. And these limits or boundaries that we cannot change, I think, is the really big point. They're just there, and we can understand them, we can think about them, but we can't change them. And ultimately, I don't know if they need to be accepted, but we need to come to terms with them because we can't change them. Of course, death is the central one, and this shows us that more or less the Epicureans, just as Jonas was, are working with the Epicurean view of death, that death is the ultimate limit of life, that there's nothing beyond it. So there's nothing we can do about it. It is a true boundary. But there are other boundary situations too. He mentions guilt, suffering, conflict, and I believe chance. And I hope that I've explained that as best I can, at least my grasp of it in the videos on this reading. But it's an interesting thing, like especially something like guilt and suffering. Guilt is about things we've done in the past. These things cannot be changed. We can only deal with them in the sense that we to some degree have to accept what we've done. Guilt is one of those situations where we run up against the limits of what we can change, what we can fix. And suffering too, there's, pain, both physical and mental or psychological or emotional pain is just something we have to endure. As part of being alive, it's that boundary in the sense that it's this thing that we run up against and we find that we can't change it. Number 3, if I merely accept that all human beings are mortal, that they will die, I am not, according to Heidegger, living in the truth. Why not? I hope this question wasn't too much of a mystery. But I simply meant that, according to Heidegger, realizing that people die, or that all men are mortal, or all human beings are mortal, is not enough, because my awareness of death has to be personal. My awareness of death has to be a consciousness of my own impending death, my own mortality. So I don't know what the German is, but in English we would say they die or people die. But the point is that I will die. And there's a kind of a false consciousness where if we on an abstract or general level accept the mortality of human beings, it doesn't necessarily mean that we've accepted our own personal mortality. And that is what has to be done in order to live in the so-called truth. According to Gray, Heidegger claims that, quote, I have no claim on any but the present moment. What does this have to do with death? Well, I hope also that this question wasn't too much of a mystery. The present moment is all we have, in the sense that the future is not here yet. The past is gone. We are, in a sense, always in the present. Of course, moving into the future, moving away from the past, but we're always here in the present. My understanding of what Gray is getting at in Heidegger is that, and this is heavily influenced by that clip from My Dinner with Andre that I showed you today in the live session, that we cannot actually be in the moment unless we're open to our own deaths. That is, the price we pay for being in the moment, being there, you might say, really being there. And let's say, as Andre said, or as Wally says in the film, experiencing our own being is that we also experience that being moving towards death. So being in the present means, to a certain degree, being open to death, because we become aware of ourselves as creatures that are heading towards our limit, heading towards death. That's why Heidegger says that human existence is an existence towards death. That's what we essentially are. 5, Heidegger advocates an openness to death and goes so far as to characterize human existence as a being unto death. Why? Well, I guess that's really what I was talking about in response to question 4, that an openness to death is an openness to our own being. And the kind of avoidance, let's say, into a false sense of safety is a kind of a running away from truth, a denial. An openness to death is an openness to our own being, because if we are essentially beings, a being unto death, or an existence unto death, a being towards death, then if we're open, we have to be open to death. We have to have some form of death consciousness in order to sort of realize what kind of beings we actually are, so that if we're kind of not confronting that finitude, then we're not, we lack any kind of knowledge of who we actually are.